My name is Claire Morgan, and the moment my father realized he couldn't sell the house anymore, he looked at me like I had betrayed the family. The sheriff stood quietly beside the lawyer in our living room, sunlight cutting through the old lace curtains my grandmother had hung there 40 years earlier. My father's face had turned a shade I'd never seen before, somewhere between anger and disbelief. "What do you mean it's been transferred?" he demanded. The lawyer adjusted his glasses calmly. "Exactly what I said, Mr. Morgan. The property was transferred legally last week." My father turned toward me slowly. And that was when I said the words that had been sitting in my chest all morning. The house had already been transferred. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then my father laughed. A short, ugly sound. "Transferred to who?" I didn't answer right away. Because to understand that moment, you'd have to understand what happened the night I came home and found my grandfather dying in the dark. I hadn't planned on coming home that week. After 18 years in the Navy and the last 6 serving with Naval Special Warfare, I'd learned to make peace with distance. Home had become something I visited between deployments like a place from another life. But that Tuesday night something felt wrong. My grandfather hadn't answered his phone in 3 days. That wasn't like him. Frank Morgan was 90 years old, a Korean War veteran, stubborn as a mule and sharp as a tack. Even when arthritis made his hands ache, he still answered the phone by the second ring. So I took leave and drove the 4 hours from Norfolk to the small Ohio town where I grew up. By the time I pulled onto Maple Street, it was nearly midnight. The house looked the same as always, white siding, sagging porch steps, the old maple tree leaning over the yard. But something was wrong. No lights. And it was January. In Ohio, January nights could freeze the bones. I knocked on the door. No answer. I tried the handle. Unlocked. The moment I stepped inside, the cold hit me. Not just chilly. Dead cold. The kind of cold that meant the heat had been turned off. I felt it immediately, the way you learn to sense danger after enough years in uniform. Something wasn't right. "Grandpa," I called. My voice echoed through the hallway. No response. I walked into the living room. That's when I saw him. My grandfather was lying on the old couch near the window, wrapped in a thin blanket, shaking so hard the couch cushions trembled. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then training kicked in. "Grandpa." I crossed the room in 3 steps. His skin felt like ice. His lips were pale. The thermostat on the wall read 47 degrees. "Jesus," I whispered. I grabbed the blanket from the recliner and wrapped it around him, then rushed to the thermostat and turned the heat back on. "Claire," he murmured weakly. "I'm here." I knelt beside the couch. His breathing rattled in his chest. "How long have you been like this?" He tried to answer but started coughing instead. That's when I noticed the note sitting on the kitchen counter. I walked over and picked it up. 2 sentences, written in my mother's tight handwriting. "We're leaving for a cruise, back in 2 weeks. No explanation. No instructions. Nothing about leaving a 90-year-old man alone in a freezing house." My stomach turned. I walked back to the couch. "Did they turn the heat off?" My grandfather looked away. That told me everything. The next morning, after the paramedics checked him and said he'd be okay with rest and warmth, I made coffee in the same chipped mug I'd used since high school. Grandpa sat at the kitchen table wrapped in 3 blankets. He looked smaller than I remembered. Old. And tired. "I didn't want to bother you," he said quietly. "You weren't bothering me. They said they needed the house empty when they came back." I froze. "What do you mean?" My grandfather hesitated. Then he said something that made the room go silent. "They're selling the house." The mug stopped halfway to my lips. "Selling it." He nodded slowly. "They said I already signed the papers." I stared at him. "You did?" "I thought it was paperwork for insurance," he said. "Your father said it was routine." Something cold settled in my chest. That afternoon, my parents called from somewhere in the Caribbean. My father didn't even ask how Grandpa was doing. Instead, he got straight to the point. "We're selling the house," he said coldly. "He already signed everything." I leaned against the kitchen counter. "You won't get a single cent." The line went quiet, and I did something that surprised him. I smiled. He heard it in my voice. "What's so funny?" he demanded. I looked over at my grandfather sitting quietly at the table. Then I said the words that would change everything. The house had already been transferred. And on the other end of the phone, my father stopped breathing for a moment. But the truth was, that transfer didn't happen until later that night, after my grandfather said something that changed the entire story. He looked up at me across the kitchen table and whispered 3 words. "Call the lawyer." And that was the moment I realized my grandfather wasn't nearly as helpless as my parents thought. Not even close. Because Frank Morgan had survived a war. And men like that don't go quietly. Not even at 90. The first thing my grandfather did after telling me to call the lawyer was sit back in his chair and close his eyes for a moment. Not because he was weak, but because he was thinking. That was something I remembered from childhood. Grandpa Frank never rushed his thoughts. He believed that when you were dealing with serious matters, family, money, or honor, you took a moment to breathe before speaking. I picked up the phone on the kitchen wall. "Who am I calling?" I asked. He opened one eye and nodded toward the old wooden desk in the corner of the dining room. "Bottom drawer," he said. That desk had been there my entire life. My grandmother had bought it from a hardware store back in 1978. Grandpa kept everything in it: tax papers, old letters, insurance forms. I pulled open the drawer. Inside was a neatly organized stack of folders. One of them had a yellow sticky note on it. "Harrison and Levine, attorney." I carried the folder back to the table. "You planned this?" I asked quietly. Grandpa gave a faint smile. "I hoped I wouldn't have to." I dialed the number. A calm woman answered and transferred me to Mr. Levine. When I explained who I was and that Frank Morgan needed to speak with him urgently, the lawyer didn't sound surprised. He simply said, "I'll be there this afternoon." That was when I realized something important. My grandfather had already started preparing. While we waited, I made soup and kept the heat running. Slowly, the house began to warm again the way it used to during winters when Grandma was still alive. Grandpa sat at the kitchen table watching the snow outside. "Your father wasn't always like this," he said after a while. I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure that was true. My father had always been ambitious. Even when I was a kid, he talked about money, constantly promotions, investments, property. Grandpa believed in different things: work, honor, community. Growing up, I spent more time with him than with my parents. They were always busy. Business trips, golf outings, dinner parties. Meanwhile, Grandpa was the one who helped me with homework at the kitchen table, drove me to softball practice, and taught me how to change the oil in a car. When I was 12, he took me fishing on Lake Erie. I remember asking him why he never bragged about his military service. Most of the men in town talked about their time in uniform. Grandpa didn't. He just said something I never forgot. "Real service isn't something you brag about, Claire. It's something you carry quietly." That sentence stayed with me. Years later, when I decided to join the Navy, my parents were furious. My father called it a waste of my education. But Grandpa just nodded. "Serve with integrity," he told me the day I left for boot camp. And that was that. Around 3 in the afternoon, a gray sedan pulled into the driveway. A tall man in a dark coat stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. Mr. Daniel Levine. He looked about 65 with silver hair and the calm expression of someone who had spent decades dealing with family disputes. When he entered the house, the first thing he did was shake my grandfather's hand. "Frank," he said warmly. "Daniel." They looked at each other for a moment like 2 old soldiers who understood things without saying them. Then Mr. Levine turned to me. "You must be Claire." "Yes, sir. Your grandfather has spoken about you many times." I helped him take off his coat. The 3 of us sat at the kitchen table. Mr. Levine opened his briefcase and laid several documents on the table. Before we even began discussing them, he looked at my grandfather carefully. "Frank, are you feeling clear-minded today?" My grandfather chuckled. "Clearer than my son, that's for sure." The lawyer nodded. "Good, because what we're about to discuss requires you to be completely certain." I leaned forward. "What exactly are we discussing?" Mr. Levine folded his hands. "The house." Grandpa glanced at me. Then he said something that made the entire situation suddenly make sense. "Your father's been pushing me for months to sign it over." My stomach tightened. He said it was time to simplify things, Grandpa continued. Told me managing property was too much for a man my age. Mr. Levine nodded slightly. "We suspected that might be happening." "You suspected?" I asked. The lawyer slid a document toward me. Your grandfather contacted me 2 weeks ago after becoming uncomfortable with the paperwork your parents presented. I scanned the page. It was a property transfer agreement. But something about it looked wrong. Wait, I said slowly. This transfers the house directly to my parents. Exactly, Mr. Levine said. And they told him it was insurance paperwork. My grandfather nodded quietly. I felt my jaw tighten. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Grandpa took a deep breath. I may be old, he said, but I'm not stupid. Mr. Levine allowed himself a small smile. That's why we prepared something else. He opened another folder. Inside were several official documents with county stamps. Trust agreements. Property records. Legal signatures. I read the title carefully. Morgan Family Residential Trust. My eyes widened. You already changed it. Mr. Levine nodded. Not yet finalized, but prepared. My grandfather looked at me. Last night, he said quietly, I realized something. What? If a man raises his children right, he shouldn't have to fear them. The sadness in his voice hit me harder than anger would have. So he continued, I decided to protect what your grandmother and I built. Mr. Levine turned another page. This trust ensures the property cannot be sold without the trustee's approval. Trustee, I asked. The lawyer looked directly at me. That would be you, Claire. The kitchen went silent. My grandfather reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. You're the only one who came home. I swallowed hard. But Dad will lose his mind. Grandpa shrugged slightly. That's his problem. Mr. Levine slid a pen toward my grandfather. All we need now is your final signature. Grandpa picked up the pen. His hand trembled slightly from age. But his voice was steady. Let's finish this. As the pen touched the paper, something shifted in the room. Not revenge. Something quieter than that. Justice. And somewhere in the Caribbean, my parents were still celebrating a cruise they thought would end with a house sale. They had no idea the story had already changed. The moment my grandfather finished signing the documents, Mr. Levine carefully gathered the papers and placed them back into his leather briefcase. He didn't rush. Lawyers like him never rushed important things. Instead, he sat quietly for a moment, looking over the table the way a man might study a chessboard after making a decisive move. Well, he said, finally, that settles the legal side. I leaned back in the chair, trying to absorb everything that had just happened. Outside, the snow had started falling again, big slow flakes drifting down over Maple Street. Inside the kitchen, the heater hummed steadily, pushing warm air through vents that had been silent the night before. It felt like the house itself had come back to life. Grandpa sat quietly beside me, rubbing his hands together to warm them. You all right? I asked. He nodded. Better than yesterday. That was true. His color had already improved and the shaking had stopped now that the house was warm again. But something else had changed too. The tired look in his eyes had been replaced by something firmer. Resolve. Mr. Levine cleared his throat. There are a few more things we should discuss. I turned back toward him. What kind of things? Your parents. That word hung in the air for a moment. Grandpa sighed. I figured that part was coming. The lawyer folded his hands calmly on the table. Frank, once the county records this transfer, your son will no longer have any legal authority to sell or transfer the property. That's the idea, Grandpa said. Yes, Mr. Levine replied, but it will almost certainly cause a confrontation. I gave a small laugh. Almost certainly. Mr. Levine smiled faintly. I try to avoid predicting family arguments, but in this case, I'd say the odds are very high. Grandpa nodded slowly. They already have a buyer. That caught my attention. What do you mean? Grandpa looked at me carefully before answering. Your father's been talking to a developer. My stomach tightened. What kind of developer? One of those companies buying up older houses around town. I knew exactly what he meant. Over the last few years, investors had been moving through small towns across Ohio, buying older homes and tearing them down to build bigger properties. The kind of houses that looked nothing like the neighborhoods they replaced. Grandpa continued. He promised them the sale would go through when they got back from their trip. Mr. Levine nodded slowly. That explains the timing. I leaned forward. So when they come back, they'll expect the house to already be theirs to sell the lawyer finished. Grandpa chuckled quietly. Well, that'll be a surprise. We spent the next hour going through the details of the trust. Mr. Levine explained everything carefully the way a good attorney does when dealing with older clients. The trust placed the house into protected ownership. Grandpa would remain the lifetime resident. No one could force him out, and after he passed, the property wouldn't automatically belong to my parents. Instead, the trust would determine how it was used. You mentioned something earlier, I said to the lawyer. About conditions. Mr. Levine nodded. Yes. He opened the folder again and turned to a specific page. Your grandfather added a clause this morning. I looked at Grandpa. You added something. He shrugged. Seemed fair. Mr. Levine slid the paper toward me. I read the paragraph slowly. The trust stated that after Grandpa's passing, the house would remain in the trust for community use, specifically as a place where local veterans and families could gather. A small community house. The kind of place my grandmother would have loved. I felt my throat tighten. You planned this. Grandpa nodded toward the living room. Your grandmother always said that house should bring people together. I remembered that. Sunday dinners. Neighbors dropping by. Veterans from the local American Legion stopping in for coffee. That house had always been full of people once. I didn't want it torn down, Grandpa said quietly. Neither did I. After Mr. Levine left that afternoon, the house felt peaceful again. I made grilled cheese sandwiches for dinner the way Grandpa liked them. Extra butter on the bread. We ate at the kitchen table while the snow continued falling outside. For a while we didn't talk much. Just listened to the quiet creaks of the house settling. Finally, Grandpa spoke. Your father wasn't always this way. I stirred my soup slowly. I know. When he was young, he used to help me fix things around the house, always asking questions. What happened? Grandpa thought about that for a long moment. Somewhere along the way, he started believing money mattered more than people. I didn't respond. Because I had seen that change myself. Not just in him. In a lot of people. But that didn't make it easier when it was your own family. Grandpa looked at me. You ever regret joining the Navy? Not once. He nodded. Good. Then he said something that stuck with me. Service keeps a person honest. 2 days passed quietly. Grandpa's strength slowly returned. Neighbors stopped by after hearing he'd been sick. Mrs. Carter from next door brought over a casserole. Old Mr. Jenkins from down the street dropped off a bag of oranges. Small-town kindness. The kind you don't see much in big cities anymore. On the third morning, Mr. Levine called. It's official, he said. The county recorded the trust this morning. I leaned against the kitchen counter. So it's done. Yes. And my parents, they still have no legal claim to the property. I thanked him and hung up. Grandpa looked up from the newspaper. Well, it's finished. He nodded slowly. Good. But then he added something that made me pause. They'll be back soon. I glanced at the calendar on the wall. Their cruise ended in 3 days, which meant the confrontation was coming. And when it did, they were going to learn something important. The house they thought they owned. The house they had already promised to sell. The house they believed I would never inherit. Was never theirs to begin with. My parents came back on a Thursday. I remember the day clearly because the sky was that flat winter gray you get in the Midwest, the kind that makes everything look washed out. The snow from earlier in the week had hardened into ridges along the curb, and the front yard looked tired and frozen. Grandpa was sitting in his recliner by the window, a wool blanket over his legs, watching the street like a man waiting for weather to turn. They'll be here before noon, he said. How do you know? He gave me a faint smile. Your mother always likes to get home early enough to unpack before dinner. That sounded like her. My mother believed in appearances, clean counters, matching towels, thank you cards. And yet somehow leaving her 90-year-old father-in-law alone in a freezing house had not disturbed that sense of order one bit. I had spent the morning making sure Grandpa took his medicine and ate a decent breakfast. He was stronger now, still old, still recovering, but back to sounding like himself. Sharp, clear, in control. At 10:30, Mr. Levine arrived. He came in carrying the same leather briefcase and wearing a dark overcoat dusted with road salt. He set the briefcase on the dining room table and nodded to Grandpa. You ready for this, Frank? Grandpa folded the newspaper in his lap. As ready as I'll ever be. Mr. Levine turned to me. The deputy should be here shortly. I nodded. That had been his idea, not mine. He said it was always wise to have a neutral witness present when legal disputes involved property emotions and adult children with inflated expectations. At 10:50, Deputy Harris pulled into the driveway. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, whom I recognized from high school football games and charity breakfasts at the VFW Hall. In small towns, the deputy often knew everybody's business long before he knocked on a door. He stepped inside, removed his hat politely, and greeted Grandpa first. "Frank." "Tom." Deputy Harris looked around the room, taking in the atmosphere quickly. Lawyer, briefcase, me standing near the fireplace. Grandpa calm in his chair. He understood right away. "Mr. Levine said you wanted me present just to keep things peaceful." "That's right," the lawyer said. The deputy gave one slow nod. "Fine by me." At 11:12, my mother's SUV turned onto Maple Street. I watched from the front window as it pulled into the driveway behind the lawyer's sedan and the patrol vehicle. Even from inside, I could feel the confusion that must have hit them when they saw the sheriff's markings. The driver's door opened first. My father stepped out wearing a tan winter coat over a golf shirt like he had dressed for a resort and forgotten he was returning to Ohio in January. My mother came around the passenger side in a camel-colored coat, her purse tucked tightly under one arm. They stood in the driveway for a moment, staring at the house. Then my father said something I couldn't hear and started toward the porch. He opened the front door without knocking. The moment he stepped inside and saw all of us, he stopped short. "What is this?" he asked. No one answered immediately. My mother came in behind him, looked from the deputy to the lawyer to Grandpa, and then finally to me. Her expression changed first. Not fear. Annoyance. As if we had rearranged a room without her permission. "Claire," she said, "what on earth is going on?" I stood with my hands loosely at my sides. "We're waiting for you." My father let out a short laugh that carried no humor at all. "Well, we're here." Mr. Levine stepped forward with measured politeness. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Morgan." My father's jaw tightened. Why is a lawyer in my father's house? Grandpa spoke before anyone else could. "Because it's still my house." My mother blinked. My father looked from him to the briefcase and then to me. "I don't have time for games," he said. "We have a meeting tomorrow with the buyer." "No," Mr. Levine said calmly, "you do not." That landed in the room like a dropped tool in a quiet garage. My father turned sharply. "Excuse me." Mr. Levine opened his briefcase, removed a folder, and handed over a set of documents. The property located at 214 Maple Street was transferred into the Morgan Family Residential Trust and recorded by the county 3 days ago. For a moment, my father simply stared at the paper. Then he laughed. A loud, reckless laugh. "That's impossible." "It is not," Mr. Levine said. My mother stepped closer. "Frank, what is this?" Grandpa didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "It's me making sure you don't sell my home out from under me." My father's face reddened. "You already signed the papers." "I signed what you told me was insurance paperwork." "That's not what happened." "It is exactly what happened," Grandpa said. The deputy shifted his weight but stayed silent. My father turned toward me then, and I saw something in his eyes I remembered from childhood, the look he got when control slipped away, and he could not bear it. "You did this." I met his stare. I made sure he understood what he was signing. "You had no right." That almost made me smile. "No right." My mother stepped in, voice tight and sharp. "Claire, this is family business." I looked at her for a long moment. "No," I said. Leaving a 90-year-old man in a house with the heat turned off stopped this from being family business. The room went still. My mother's mouth opened slightly. "The heat." "Don't," I said. She looked away first. My father crumpled the top page in his fist. "This won't hold up." Mr. Levine didn't even blink. "It already has. The trust is valid. The transfer is recorded. Your father remains the lifetime resident, and neither of you has authority to list, sell, transfer, or encumber this property." My father took a step toward the lawyer. Deputy Harris moved just enough to be noticed. "Let's keep this civil," the deputy said. My father stopped, breathing hard through his nose. Then he pointed at me. "You think you've won something here?" I didn't answer. He looked back at the document, scanning the lines more carefully now and then, his eyes narrowed. "What is this?" Mr. Levine folded his hands. "That, Mr. Morgan, is the trust structure." My mother took the second page and read silently. I watched the moment she saw it. The trustee provision. She lifted her head slowly. Claire. Grandpa spoke again, steady as church bells. She's the trustee. My father stared at me as if I had become a stranger. You put her in charge. Grandpa nodded once. She's the only one who showed up. That sentence cut cleaner than shouting ever could. No one moved. No one spoke. Outside, a plow scraped somewhere down the block, the sound low and metallic in the winter air. Finally, my father found his voice again. This is unbelievable. Grandpa looked straight at him. No, what's unbelievable is that you left me here to freeze. My mother sat down hard on the edge of the sofa, all the color gone from her face. For the first time since they walked in, neither of them looked angry. They looked exposed. And standing there in the old living room where my grandmother used to serve coffee cake after church, I realized something simple. They had expected to come home to a signed sale and a helpless old man. Instead, they had walked into witnesses' legal records and the truth. And the truth was not on their side. After Grandpa said she's the only one who showed up, the room went so quiet I could hear the radiator ticking in the hallway. My father still had the papers in his hand, but he wasn't waving them around anymore. He was reading now, really reading, and that changed the whole mood in the room. Anger can be loud when people think they still have options. It gets quieter when they realize they don't. My mother sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, her purse clutched in both hands. She looked smaller than she had 10 minutes earlier. Not older exactly, just less certain. Deputy Harris stayed near the front door, saying nothing but his presence mattered. It kept everyone honest. My father looked up from the papers and fixed his eyes on Grandpa. You did this behind our backs. Grandpa answered in the same calm tone he had used all morning. No, I did it after you tried to trick me. That's not fair. At that, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was so familiar. My father had spent his whole life calling things unfair when they didn't go his way. Mr. Levine opened the briefcase again and removed another set of documents. There's more, he said. My father turned sharply. More? Yes. He laid the papers out on the dining room table one by one. These are notes from prior consultations with your father, dates, summaries, and signed acknowledgments. My mother stood up then, crossing the room as if she could somehow change what was written there just by getting closer to it. What consultations, she asked. The consultations during which Mr. Morgan expressed concern that he was being pressured into signing over the house. My father's face darkened. I was helping him manage his affairs. No, Grandpa said. You were helping yourself. That one landed. I looked at my father, really looked at him. And for a moment I saw not just the angry man in the living room, but the version of him I remembered from years ago. The younger father who used to mow the lawn on Saturdays and complain about taxes at the dinner table. Somewhere along the line, money had become his only language. He talked in prices, values, percentages, commissions. Everything had a number attached to it. Even family. Mr. Levine pointed to one of the pages. Your father also informed me that a developer had already been contacted. I folded my arms. Which developer? My father shot me a warning look, but the lawyer answered anyway. Renshaw Property Group. I knew the name. Everybody in town did. They'd bought 3 old homes near the river last year and knocked them all down for a row of oversized townhouses nobody local could afford. Grandpa shook his head slowly. Your grandmother planted every flower in that front yard by hand. My mother looked down. I remembered those flowers, white peonies in May, marigolds along the walkway in summer. Grandma used to deadhead them with a little pair of scissors from the kitchen drawer. My father set the documents down with more care than before. You don't understand, he said. And this time his voice had changed. It was still tense, but no longer booming. We made commitments. To whom I asked. He didn't answer me. So Mr. Levine did. To the developer, and according to the correspondence I obtained this week, to a lender as well. That pulled everyone's attention back to the table. A lender, I said. Mr. Levine nodded. It appears your parents intended to use the expected sale proceeds to finance a move. Grandpa's eyes narrowed. Move where? My mother finally spoke very softly. Florida. It was such an ordinary answer that it almost made the whole situation worse. Florida. Like this was just some retirement plan. Sell the old man's house, buy a place in the sun, start fresh, clean and simple. Except it wasn't clean. And it wasn't simple. You were going to leave town, Grandpa said. My father rubbed his forehead. We've been planning it for months, using my house to pay for it. We needed the equity. Grandpa let out a slow breath. You mean you wanted the money? My father looked up again, frustration rising back into his face. You act like we're criminals. Deputy Harris finally spoke. No one said that. The room settled again. My father glanced toward the deputy and seemed to realize how close he was getting to saying something foolish. Mr. Levine slid another page across the table. There's one final issue. Nobody moved. The lawyer continued in the same even tone. The trust includes a statement of intent from Frank Morgan regarding the property, the attempted transfer, and the conditions under which he chose to restructure his estate. My father scoffed. A statement of intent. Yes, said Mr. Levine, and because your father dictated it in my office in the presence of 2 witnesses, it carries substantial weight. He handed the document to me first. I read it quietly. Frank Morgan stated that he no longer trusted his son and daughter-in-law to act in his best interests. He believed he had been misled. He feared displacement from his own home. He wished to protect the property from sale, preserve it for community use, and place responsibility in the hands of the person who had demonstrated actual care for his welfare. I felt my throat tighten when I reached that last line. Actual care for his welfare. My father looked at me. Let me see that. I handed it over. He read the first paragraph, then the second, then stopped, and stared at the bottom where Grandpa's signature sat firm and clear. My mother read over his shoulder. For the first time since they arrived, neither of them spoke for nearly a full minute. Then Grandpa did. I didn't do this to punish you. My father gave a bitter laugh. Could have fooled me. Grandpa shook his head. I did it because I wasn't going to die in that house while my own son waited for the closing papers. That sentence changed the room. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was true. The truth has a way of stripping people bare when they've spent too long dressing their actions up with excuses. My mother sat back down slowly. I didn't know the heat was off, she said. I looked at her. Maybe that was true. Maybe Dad had turned it off and never told her. Maybe she had walked past the thermostat and simply not looked. At their age, after all these years together, there were probably 100 quiet arrangements between them. Responsibilities divided so thoroughly that one hand no longer asked what the other was doing. But it didn't matter as much as she seemed to think it did. You still left him, I said. She lowered her eyes. Grandpa rested both hands on the arms of his chair and looked at his son. You have time to fix what you've become, he said, but not by taking what isn't yours. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. That made it harder to ignore. My father looked older then. Not suddenly old, but tired in a way that had nothing to do with travel or weather. The kind of tired that comes when a man sees himself clearly and doesn't much like the view. He set the papers down. What happens now, he asked. Mr. Levine closed the folder. Now, he said, the sale is over. And for the first time all day, nobody argued. After Mr. Levine said, now the sale is over, nobody moved for a few seconds. That was the strange thing about moments like that. People imagine confrontations ending with shouting, doors slamming, maybe somebody pointing a finger and making one last dramatic speech. But real life usually goes quieter than that. The truth lands, and then everyone has to sit with it. My father was the first to step back. Not out of grace. More out of instinct, like a man who has walked too close to a ledge and suddenly realizes there's nothing beneath his foot. He looked around the living room at the framed photos on the wall, at the old piano no one played anymore, at the braided rug my grandmother had bought in Amish country 30 years before. I could almost see him remembering that this house had once been his home too. My mother sat with both hands folded tightly in her lap. What are we supposed to do now, she asked. It was the first honest question either of them had asked all day. Mr. Levine answered gently, That depends on what you mean. My father gave a tired exhale. We made plans, we signed papers, we put money down in Florida. That the lawyer said is between you and the parties you made those commitments with. My father's mouth tightened. So that's it. We just lose everything. Grandpa shifted in his chair and looked at him steadily. No, he said, you lose what was never yours. There it was again, that simple, clean kind of truth older people tend to recognize faster than younger ones. Not cruel, not theatrical, just true. Deputy Harris glanced at the clock over the mantel. Since no one seemed in danger of throwing anything, he relaxed a little and took off his gloves. "Sounds to me like this turned into a civil matter," he said. "It has," Mr. Levine agreed. The deputy nodded toward Grandpa. "You need anything else from me, Frank?" Grandpa shook his head. "No, thank you for coming." Deputy Harris tipped his head respectfully. "Then I'll leave you folks to it." He paused at the door, looked once at my father, and added, "Best thing now would be to keep this calm." Then he stepped out into the cold and closed the door quietly behind him. The silence that followed felt more personal without him there. My father looked at the front door for a long moment, then back at Grandpa. "You called the police on us?" "No," Grandpa said. "I asked for a witness." That shut him up. Mr. Levine remained by the dining room table, one hand resting on his briefcase. "There's one last matter I should clarify," he said. I turned toward him. He opened the trust folder again and removed the summary page. "The trust places legal oversight with Claire as trustee," he said, glancing at my parents, "but she is not the owner." My mother frowned. "Then who owns it?" "The trust does," he said. "That is the purpose of the trust." My father blinked. "So she doesn't get the house?" I almost smiled at how quickly he latched onto that. "No," Mr. Levine said. "She does not personally inherit the property in the usual sense. She is responsible for seeing that Frank's instructions are followed." That changed the air in the room again. My parents looked at me differently then. Not as the victorious daughter who had somehow beaten them to the prize, but as something harder for them to resent: a steward, a caretaker, someone trusted with responsibility, not reward. Grandpa looked at me and nodded once as if to say, "Now you understand why I did it this way." And I did. If he had simply signed the house over to me, the story would have been about greed replacing greed, one heir beating out another, one child winning what another wanted. But that wasn't what he wanted. He wanted the house protected. He wanted the memory of my grandmother honored. He wanted something lasting to come out of all this ugliness. Mr. Levine continued. "Upon Frank's passing, the house is to remain in trust for community use with priority given to local veterans gatherings, family support events, and neighborhood civic purposes, as detailed in the attached memorandum." My mother looked genuinely confused now. "You mean no one gets to sell it?" "That is correct." "No one?" my father asked. "No one." He stared at the papers again. For months, maybe longer, he had built an entire future around this property. Florida equity, a planned sale, a clean exit. And now all of it had dissolved. Not because someone outplayed him. Because he had mistaken access for ownership, blood for entitlement. Grandpa folded the blanket on his lap more neatly and spoke into the quiet. "Your mother loved this house." He didn't mean my mother. He meant Grandma. That was obvious to everyone. "She wanted Sunday dinners here," he said. "Christmases, people stopping by, children on the porch in summer. I let too much of that slip away after she died." His voice was softer now, less like testimony and more like confession. "I won't let the house become just another number on somebody's paperwork." I looked around the room and could see what he meant. The pine cabinet in the corner. The hallway where Grandma used to mark my height with pencil each birthday. The kitchen window over the sink where she'd set pies to cool. For developers and lenders it was property. For Grandpa it was a life. My mother's eyes had filled a little by then, though she blinked quickly and looked away. My father remained standing, one hand on the back of a dining chair, his shoulders lower than before. "What if we apologize?" he asked. No one expected that. Not even him, I think. He sounded almost irritated by the words the moment they were out. Grandpa studied him for a long moment. "An apology is a start," he said, "not a settlement." My father nodded once. There was no argument in him now, only fatigue. Mr. Levine closed the folder and snapped the clasp on his briefcase. "I think that's enough for today," he said. "Frank needs rest." My mother stood first. She looked at Grandpa, then at me. "We didn't think," she began, then stopped. That was probably the truest thing she could have said. They hadn't thought. Not really. Not past the cruise tickets, the sale date, the move the price per square foot. My father picked up his coat from the arm of the sofa. At the doorway he turned back. He looked at Grandpa first. Then at the room. Then at me. And for the first time in years there was no anger in his face. Only shame. He nodded once, a small stiff movement. "We'll come back," he said. Grandpa answered without hesitation. Then come back as family. After they left, the house went still again. No sirens, no shouting, no slammed doors. Just the low hum of the heat and the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Mr. Levine gathered his things and paused beside Grandpa's chair. "You did the right thing," he said. Grandpa looked up at him. "I know." After the lawyer left, I made tea. Grandpa sat quietly while I moved around the kitchen. When I finally carried his cup into the living room, he looked up at me and said, "You're disappointed." I sat down across from him. I thought I'd feel more satisfaction. He smiled faintly. "That's because you were looking for justice, not revenge." I let that sit for a while. Outside, the snow had begun again. Soft. Steady. The kind that covers things without erasing them. And in that warm, old house with the papers signed and the future changed, I realized something I hadn't understood when I first walked in and found him shivering in the dark. Winning wasn't going to come from taking something from my parents. It was going to come from keeping one good thing alive. Winter held on for another few weeks after that day. The kind of Ohio winter that lingers just long enough to make everyone grateful for spring. The snow slowly softened into gray slush along Maple Street, and the frozen yard outside Grandpa's window began to show patches of brown grass again. Life settled into a quieter rhythm. My parents didn't come back right away. For the first couple of weeks, the house felt almost peaceful. Grandpa read the newspaper every morning at the kitchen table the same way he had for decades. I made breakfast, helped him keep up with his medications, and shoveled the walkway when the weather demanded it. Neighbors started stopping by again. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when something unusual happens. Mrs. Carter came by with another casserole. Mr. Jenkins from down the block brought over a jar of homemade pickles and stayed for an hour telling stories about the steel mill where he and Grandpa had worked in the 70s. One afternoon, 2 men from the American Legion stopped by to check on Grandpa. They stayed longer than planned. Coffee turned into stories, stories turned into laughter. Watching them sit in the living room, leaning forward in their chairs, swapping old military memories, I began to see exactly what Grandpa had meant when he wrote the trust. The house felt alive again. Not because of the building, because of the people in it. By early March, Grandpa was walking more steadily. Still slow, still careful, but strong enough to make it from the bedroom to the front porch on his own. One afternoon, we sat outside together under the pale sun while the last of the snow melted along the curb. "You know," he said, looking down Maple Street, "your grandmother used to say this porch was the best seat in town." I smiled. "I remember." He leaned back in the old wooden rocker. "Claire." "Yes." "You still planning to go back to the Navy?" I nodded. "My leave ends next month." He didn't look surprised. "You've always had somewhere to serve." I thought about that for a moment. For most of my life, service had meant uniforms, deployments, and missions far from home. But now, sitting on that porch, I realized service could also mean something simpler. Showing up. Taking care of the people who once took care of you. My parents finally came back on a Sunday afternoon in April. They didn't arrive with anger this time. Just quiet. My mother carried a small bakery box. My father stood beside her on the porch, looking older than he had 2 months earlier. Not dramatically older. Just worn down. Grandpa opened the door himself. None of us spoke for a few seconds. Then my mother held out the box. "I brought apple pie," she said. It wasn't a grand apology. But in our family, food had always been a kind of language. Grandpa stepped aside. "Well," he said, "don't let it get cold." They sat in the same living room where the argument had taken place weeks before. Only this time there were no lawyers. No deputies. Just 4 people and a pie cooling on the coffee table. My father cleared his throat. "I spoke to the developer," he said. Grandpa didn't respond. "The deal's off." "I know." My father looked surprised. "You knew. This is a small town." That almost made me laugh. My mother folded her hands together. "We're not moving to Florida," she said quietly. Grandpa studied her for a moment. "That might be wise." My father looked at the floor. "I'm sorry," he said. The words sounded heavy, like something he had practiced more than once before finally saying them. Grandpa didn't rush to answer. He just looked at his son the way fathers sometimes do, seeing both the child they raised and the man standing in front of them. "Then start acting like my son again," he said. "It wasn't forgiveness exactly." But it was the door opening. Spring arrived slowly after that. The maple tree in the yard began to bud again. Neighbors stopped by more often. Sometimes veterans from the Legion came over on Saturday mornings to drink coffee and talk. Once a young couple from down the street asked if they could use the living room for a small community meeting. Grandpa looked at me and smiled. Seems the trust is already working. And he was right. The house was becoming what it had always been meant to be, a place where people gathered. Grandpa passed away peacefully the following autumn. He was 91. The morning it happened, sunlight was coming through the same lace curtains my grandmother had hung years before. He squeezed my hand once, smiled faintly, and then simply rested. The funeral was held at the small church 3 blocks away. I expected maybe 30 people. More than 100 showed up. Neighbors. Veterans. People from the town who had known him for decades. Even the 2 Legion men who had first come by brought half their post with them. After the service, everyone gathered back at the house on Maple Street. Just like Grandma used to do. Coffee on the kitchen counter. Folding chairs in the living room. Stories filling every corner. My parents were there too. My father helped carry chairs from the garage. My mother poured coffee and handed out slices of pie. They didn't say much, but they stayed. And sometimes that's where reconciliation really begins. Not in big speeches, but in quiet acts. Today the house still stands on Maple Street. Every month the American Legion holds a small gathering there. Neighbors use it for meetings. Families bring casseroles and stories and laughter through the same front door. And whenever I visit town between deployments, I sit on that porch and watch the street the way Grandpa used to. Because in the end, the house was never about property. It was about people. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't taking something away from those who wronged you. Sometimes it's protecting what truly matters. If this story touched you in some small way, if it reminded you of a home, a parent, or a grandparent who shaped your life, then I hope you'll take a moment to share it with someone who might need that reminder too. Stories like this aren't just about justice. They're about remembering what family is supposed to be. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, you're always welcome to come back and listen again. Thank you for spending this time with me.